Here we have a clear demonstration that what had been reported historically to be an irreversible condition, autism, is now responding to something that targets inflammation in the gut.
What is up, guys? We are coming at you with episode 3. I am so excited and thrilled and just honored to be sitting down with one of my favorite people, Dr. Andrew Wakefield. He is one of the OGs in the vaccine movement. He is paving the way. He has been one of those docs that has stood in the foxhole for a very long time, one that has stood in the gap. He is bringing so much truth and so many just awesome projects in the works. He has written many books. He has put out documentaries. One of my favorite documentaries that I recommend all the time is 1986, The Act. It is a documentary exposing just the corruption with the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act of '86. Also, he has a new film coming out, Protocol 7. I highly recommend watching. But I just hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, this is our 3rd episode. Please like, subscribe, and share this information. If you want to support us, you can. For basically the cost of a cup of coffee, you can support us and show love for us and just help us in our projects. Guys, thank you so much for listening. Tune in, and I hope you enjoy this episode. To August of last year, nobody really knew who I was.
There's about 12 people who are producing 65% of anti-vaccine misinformation.
We need to come together as Americans and realize that we have a war at hand here. Right?
Like, dude, how scared of this shit do you have to be to be wearing gloves, a face shield, a mask at this point?
Help us to urge folks and say to them, look, it's time to roll up your sleeve and get the shot.
Chiropractor in Omaha, Nebraska, responsible for 65% of the anti-vaccine misinformation. Put what I say to the test. Just don't write me off as crazy misinformation.
Doctor, please bring yourself in.
600,000 people will die of cancer. 300,000 people will die of obesity this year. When is enough enough?
Dr. Wakefield, how are you, brother? It's good to see you today.
Ben, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on again.
Oh yeah, it's always good to see you. You've been, I like to call you the OG. You've been the tip of the spear for a long time, brother, and you have influenced me in ways that I can't even talk about, man. So you're a hero of mine and so many. So I'm just honored to be sitting here with you. You've been busy.
Yes, it may not seem that way. People say, oh, Wakefield, but I never actually went away, but we've been making a full-length narrative feature film, and that takes a little while. So it gives the appearance that not much is going on. Yeah. And then suddenly that hits the silver screen, and it's all action.
I love it. This is a different kind of film than what you've been used to putting out. This is a different angle, and I love it. It's more of I'd say a movie feel, and it's just telling the truth in a different way and more of like a movie format. So it's not the documentary style that we're used to coming from you. So kind of what inspired that angle? I want to know more about that. What kind of brought this on?
Well, I've always loved screenwriting. I started screenwriting in 2004, and this was a story, a classic whistleblower story of, the little guy against the huge corporation, in this case, Merck, and it lent itself very, very well to a narrative feature film. And so I'd made, as you say, I made 4 documentaries. It was time creatively to move on to something that gave me more dramatic license, if you like. And I love working with actors, and so that gave me the opportunity to do that. And so, yeah, this was a departure. It was completely terrifying.
Yeah.
And you've got to try and appear on set to know exactly what it is you're doing and what you want, even though you're not sure yourself. But it's all down to preparation, and I loved it. I had a great crew, a great cast, great producers, and they really made my life very easy.
Well, Doc, I'm just super thankful that you're continuing to put this kind of material out, because obviously more than anyone the burden that we carry here is heavy, and it's and we need to keep pushing forward and keep pushing that our side of the story out. And I know you've experienced censorship, and I kind of want to dive into that. The things that, excuse me, the censorship that you've experienced. I've experienced it as well. And I've been in this fight not as long as you, but it's amazing to me the amount of censorship that occurs just in the slanderous agendas that the media and big pharma push against docs like you. It's amazing to me that people are so just, I hate to say it, they're just ignorant. They keep their head in the sand, and it's like they're parroting what the media tells them. They don't ever dig into what the real truth is here, and they are just complacent with what the news tells them, and it drives me bonkers. But tell me, like, going back to the roots of censorship early on, tell me how you've been censored and how you've been dealt, and how you, I don't know, dealt with that in your life.
Well, in the beginning, now going back, this is 25 years ago, and when I first got involved in looking at vaccines and health risks from vaccines, particularly in the context of inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, colitis, and then latterly autism. It was virtually unheard of that cancel culture wasn't heard of. It wasn't that censorship hadn't been rife before. It's that in this context where an insider comes along with a new novel observation and you report it. But this had the combined effect of threatening both the pharmaceutical industry's bottom line, the vaccine manufacturer's bottom line, in the setting of MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella, and also government policy. And they got together and they decided that they were going to use the media to destroy my career. And they did that very effectively. And at that time, there was me. And I don't say this to sound as though it's a hard luck story for Andy Wakefield. I'm an adult. I had a choice and I made my choice and I live with that choice. But there was me on the one hand, and on the other hand, there was the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the pharmaceutical companies, the British government, the American government, the other governments of the world, the American Academy of Pediatrics. It was not a balanced battle, if you like. Things have changed dramatically, and they've changed dramatically in the face of two things that, in my experience, one is film, to which I've contributed, Del Bigtree, Mickey Willis, and others have contributed. And the other, of course, is the experience with COVID. And that has had a profound effect upon the public perception, not only of freedom of speech and First Amendment rights and censorship, but also the dishonesty of public health. I mean, we're watching Tony Fauci being eviscerated before a subcommittee at the moment over the lies he's told about COVID and its origins and the vaccine. And public health is really in a dire strait at the moment, so that people are ready for this message, so that even though the censorship is there, we are prevailing. We're prevailing simply because it's the truth and the facts are getting out and people will not be deceived. And so it's been a very interesting journey. When we released, for example, Vaxxed, the documentary Vaxxed about fraud in the context of MMR at the CDC, then it was censored from Tribeca, one of the preeminent film festivals in the world. That was a bad few days until Robert De Niro went on national television on the Today Show and Good Morning America and said we should never have done that. Everybody should watch this film and make up their own minds. And it exploded worldwide.
Yes.
So there you have a situation in which paradoxically the censorship backfired on them completely. And everybody got to learn about the film they were not allowed to see at Tribeca. And so it exploded. So with the next film, they kind of learned a lesson. And in 1986, the Act, which was the history of the sort of National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act.
A phenomenal film.
Thank you. They were very quiet, and they were helped in their censorship by the movie theaters being closed and us being blocked by streaming services like Vimeo and like YouTube, we weren't allowed on, and so that, to an extent, did succeed. The audience that got to see that film was relatively limited. Now, so what will happen this time? And that's the question. What will they do with this major narrative feature film that, as you say, is designed for the movie theaters? And um, it's going to be very interesting to see. So far, Merck have refused to comment. Their lawyers have refused to comment. They're fully aware of the content of the film. And it's going to be interesting to see how they react. If they react, then it may play out like the Tribeca experience. It may actually be to the film's advantage, even though they may try and sue us for defamation. I don't think they have any grounds to do that, and we've sought legal counsel on that. So it's going to be an interesting time. But here's the good news. The good news is that on the one hand, the film has already won 17 film awards before it was even released.
Awesome.
So that's very exciting. That's all and that's almost sort of moving into the mainstream. It's a dangerous place to be. I'm not used to that. And then the other is that we've picked up distribution contracts from a major distributor, a major theater chain in America, and across Canada with Cineplex cinemas. So it's really, as you pointed out at the very beginning, this is a mainstream feature film, and the public, I hope, will see it as such, and will go and watch it. It'll get people back to the movie theaters in a way that they haven't been, perhaps, since Sound of Freedom.
Fantastic. I know we just had a showing here in Omaha, Nebraska here. And I know people can go around and go to the site and find the showings, Protocol 7. And I think it's a much, it's a must-see film, just as are your other films. And I think that, just like Vax, when I have patients or anybody that tells me, hey, where can I find information on vaccines? I always say, go watch the documentary. Go watch Vax 2. Go watch, 1986 The Act. I always direct them to your site, the 1986theact.com. And I always tell patients, go watch those films. Because, I have done vaccine lectures for 15 years, and I have told patients, like, logically why they should, question vaccines, and here's the science. And they become like glossy-eyed. They just don't want to really hear it. But what they are moved by is our patient testimonials, patients' emotions. And I brought a good friend of mine to Vaxxed, and he literally was bawling in the movie. And it was to the point where I was like, dude, are you okay? And I'm like, I didn't mean to, and he just started crying because he had no idea. He had no idea of the magnitude of the deception and the lies that we've been fed. And he couldn't really fathom the idea of, like, oh my gosh, his whole world was like uprooted in this area. And because we had some dialogue, and I was like, dude, just come see this film, watch this film, please. And he did, and he came, and it really touched him. And so people are moved by emotion. And so I think if we can just really target that aspect and keep sharing testimonials and even like these whistleblower stories in Protocol 7, I think it's people are moved by that, and they start questioning the narrative, because we've been fed this lie, this massive, massive lie. And I think it's one of the greatest lies ever told. And so I firmly believe we are on the right side of history. We are on the right side of science. We are on the right side of truth. And it's people like you that, are going to go down in history books. And I pray, Doc, that you see that and understand that it's like you are doing a good thing. You are a light in the darkness. And I want to encourage you, my friend, to keep pushing forward in these times, because we are in crazy times. And the truth is needed more now than ever before. And the people are starving for it. So God bless you for putting that film out, man. And just I want to touch on where people can see that film, Doc. Why don't you just put a plug in right now for that film?
Great. Well, I just say before I do that I promise you we will keep doing this, and we will keep making these movies. We have a slate of films in a similar vein that we're working on right now, and so expect more. This is not the time to walk away and think that our job is done. The price of democracy is constant vigilance, and we have to keep fighting. Amen. The place to go and see the movie, at the moment, I'll just give you an update. It's premiered in New York, it premieres in Austin tonight, and it premieres in California in Hollywood next Friday. And then it will go out on general release in mid-July across America. And then it'll be available to stream online from probably mid-August. The movie theaters say, can you give us a 30-day window in which to put the film out exclusively in theater and then go out online? So that tends to be the way it works. So please, to catch up with all the information, to see the trailer, to know what's going on with the film, go to protocol7.movie. It's protocol numeral 7.movie, and all of the information that you need when we have it will be up there so that you can go and see a screening. And as you pointed out, there is the opportunity still to host a screening. And this is done through a company called Gather. And you can, if you're a town with one theater and that theater doesn't carry the movie, you can still hire that theater, particularly in downtimes like sort of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday nights. And you can have that theater for the night and you can play the movie there. So on our website, there's a tab for host a screening. If you want to do that, please go and do it. It's a wonderful way of gathering friends, family, all the people who've berated you, disagreed with you, got into arguments with you over a holiday dinner. Get them along to watch it. And when you do, when you bring them to the theater, don't say, I told you so. Right. Say, this is a really interesting movie. I think rather as you did with your friend you were telling us about, and I'd value your opinion on it. And let them come and let them make up their own minds.
Right. Well, Doc, I want to just kind of shift a little bit of gears, but still kind of be under the umbrella of just vaccines in general and vaccines and just autism and correlation. When people tell me like, hey, that, oh, so-and-so vaccinated their child, they got an MMR, they went home that night, and then child had a high-pitched scream, and then the next day they stopped talking, they're nonverbal. And, they were hitting their milestones, they're hitting their landmarks. And, I've been in these debates and people are like, oh, that's anecdotal science. It's anecdotal. It's not, you can't correlate that to the vaccine. And, that drives me bonkers because they'll show all these tailored studies that are doctored. Obviously, we know that from the whistleblower, William Thompson, and everything else, that they are tailoring studies to show desired outcomes, to show no correlation between autism and vaccinations. But what do you tell patients when this is anecdotal, or like there's really no observational data to prove? And I beg to differ. So I want to know, like, right from you and what you think, what would you say to that patient?
Well, this was really the purpose of telling William Thompson's story in Vaxxed. There was a situation, I'll give you the background to it, that when the CDC and FDA were still talking to me, we were conversing over this subject. There was a meeting held at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories on Long Island. And I went to that meeting and they said, okay, Dr. Wakefield, every child gets MMR vaccine essentially, and only some develop autism. Surely there can't be a link. Well, first, how do you explain that? And firstly, I don't need to explain it because we know in medicine that a ubiquitous exposure only leads to disease in some. A lot of smokers do not develop lung cancer, and yet lung cancer is caused by smoking. So this is just the way in which medicine operates. But my group's interest was the pattern of exposure. It's not just that you're exposed to MMR, it's how you're exposed or when you're exposed. And one of our big interests was age of exposure. Why? Because we know that with natural measles, for example, age of exposure is very important. If you get it under 1, you're at more risk of a serious infection than if you get it over 1. Now, everybody understands that now because they've seen it with COVID. They know that there is an age-related risk of a bad outcome. The older you get the COVID virus, the greater, or the disease, the greater the risk of a bad outcome. So this is now familiar to everybody, but then it wasn't. And so I said, look, this is what we believe, that there are patterns of exposure, such as younger age, that are a big risk. Now, the CDC's Office of Vaccine Safety went away and they tested that hypothesis. William Thompson was the study designer, the lead author, the guy who collected the data and analyzed it. And that's exactly what they found. So now we've moved beyond anecdote. We've moved to a proper controlled scientific study that tests a specific hypothesis. Younger age of exposure incurs to MMR gives a greater risk of autism. So now we're way beyond just this anecdotal nonsense. Mm-hmm. So that's exactly what they found. For 14 years, they'd covered up the data, they destroyed the documents, and they lied to the public, to the doctors, to everybody, and said that there was no link between MMR vaccine and autism risk, when that is completely the opposite to what they found. But in my opinion, from Dr. William Thompson himself, who preserved the documents and gave them to us and said, we have done a terrible thing and I can no longer live with it. And that was the basis of Vaxxed. So to come back to your question, what I do is I say, if you want to understand this, how it goes beyond anecdote to hypothesis testing science that then becomes corrupted when you find an answer that you do not like, then you go and you watch Vaxxed and you will understand in their own words. And what they had at that time was an opportunity to say, okay, we found this risk, public, we need to alert you to it and offer you the choice of delaying the vaccine to an age when the child is perhaps at lower risk while we do a bigger study to see if we can confirm it. That's what they should have done, but they didn't do that.
Right.
14 years, they put American children deliberately, wantonly, recklessly in harm's way of a serious permanent neurological disease in order, what, to protect children? No, to protect themselves and to protect the program. And that is a disgrace.
100% it is. So where do we turn when, for a scientific standpoint, and arguably, when our literature has been compromised, where do we turn?
I think what we do is we turn to the people who have taken the risk of standing out against the system, but no benefit to themselves except to pursue their sort of moral conviction that this is the right thing to do. Peter McCullough is a classic example in the context of COVID. There is a man who's published over 750 scientific papers as a cardiologist, the world's leading cardiologist. When he came out and said, there is a problem with all of this, there's a problem with COVID, that we're seeing complications that we didn't see before. We're seeing them particularly with the COVID vaccine. It's my duty to report that and express my concerns, for which he lost his job. And these are the people that the public are learning to trust because they have risked everything, their entire career, to stand in their integrity and say, no, I cannot do this. I put my patients first and foremost above all others. And so you can know now, everybody knows you can no longer trust the experts. We have witnessed with COVID the death of experts. We've seen them paid off because of what seems to be the promise of grant funding, or indeed the threat of withdrawal of grant funding if they do not comply with Tony Fauci and the NIH's diktat on their position on whether COVID was of natural or lab-made origin. We've seen appalling behavior by these people that has only been unearthed by the persistence of people like Senator Paul. So you realize, the public have come to realize they can no longer trust that side. And in turning to people they can trust, then I would strongly recommend that they first listen to those who've risked everything to tell them the truth.
That's so good, Doc. People just need to really understand the magnitude of that statement. Those that are willing to sacrifice everything they have, their reputation, put it all on the line for the truth. I mean, that's why this whole argument that we are in is really for the truth. And the establishment, the big media, the three-letter organizations are terrified of men who are unafraid to bend a knee, to cower, for the truth, for the greater good of the people. And that's really what I get goosebumps thinking about it. That's what makes a hero. You know, Thomas Jefferson said, one man with courage is a majority. And we need to understand that, and just really, how do you say it? Band together. Because I think of scripture that, you know, a triple braided cord is much stronger together than one man alone. And when we are band together for this purpose, it doesn't take a majority to prevail, but really just that irate, tireless minority of men keen on setting the brush fires of freedom and the truth in the minds of the people. So if we can just keep pursuing that, because I feel like we are in a time where there is evil at bay. And it's like Edmund Burke said that the only thing for triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And, you know, if we stay so involved in sports and are distracted by other things here, evil is going to triumph. And just like you said, we must be diligent because evil doesn't sleep. You know, our freedoms and liberties here are at stake. And this is so much bigger than a vaccine. This is for our freedoms. This is for the truth and the sovereignty of our nation here. And, you know, and so it's really important to continue this fight and understand that truth must prevail, and it will prevail, but it's only through our dutiness and our willingness to be bold and courageous to stand in that gap. And so going forward with these three-letter organizations and the crumbling of this whole narrative with COVID and the vaccine narrative here, I mean, how would you say we can protect our freedoms in the vaccine realm and navigating these waters in a clinical setting?
I think if you go back historically, when I first got involved in this issue, there were a handful of people worldwide who were prepared to engage in the thorny debate about vaccine safety and health freedom, certainly from the perspective of scientists, doctors. Now, I think it's, you know, if you look at the majority of the adult population of the world, they are refusing to bend to the will of the pharmaceutical companies and public health. They're not taking the fifth, sixth, seventh booster shot of the COVID shot. They're not making decisions based in fear. And this is one of the key elements, is never make a decision based in fear.
Amen.
Please don't. That is so important. It's something that I've learned. And I live my life that way, whatever the consequence may be, not because I'm particularly brave or clever, but just because I found that if I can live my life and make my decisions not based on fear, then there's much greater clarity, there's much greater honesty, much greater integrity to that process. And now we are the majority. The people who are questioning policy, the people who are saying no to that fifth, sixth, seventh booster dose are the majority. And so we've gone from this tiny minority to a majority. What, you know, these people who refuse to comply with CDC policy are, in the words of the mainstream media, anti-vaxxers. So have the majority of the adult population of the world now joined the ranks of the anti-vaxxers? Well, according to their own definition, it looks like, yes, they have. And so that must be, sometimes, you know, I put myself in the position of those very wealthy people on K Street in Washington who do the public relations for the pharmaceutical company, and they're losing. And the big debate, the discussion, the anger, the screaming around their boardroom tables is, why will people not believe us? We're spending all of this money to persuade them to believe us, and yet they don't. So how is that possible? And if we think things are bad for us, well, they're certainly getting that way for people on the other side. And they can gloss over it, but only for so long. But there is a desperation, and the desperation that we've seen, this brings us back to the issue of censorship, is in things like censorship, forcing parents, coercing them, lying to them, bullying them, threatening them with child protective services, and the enormous amount of money that is being spent, wasted on public relations, or censorship dressed up as public relations. So we are prevailing, and we need to recognize that. We need to take heart from that. We need to keep going.
Right. You know, so I just can't help but think the more they try to suppress this, it's like Newton's third law of physics. You know, there's going to be an opposite and equal reaction. It's like for every action. And it's, the more they try to suppress, the more it backfires on them. Because during Crony Baloney, they overplayed their hand. And it just created this yearning for the truth, the more oppression. And I think even Martin Luther King Jr. said that when you oppress the people, eventually they're going to have a yearning for the truth and freedom. And that's exactly what's happening. They suppressed us so much. They suppressed the truth, but people, they treated us like we're idiots. And it's really, people aren't dumb. I mean, they were waking up to this. They saw through this bull BS here. And, not everybody, but like you said, the tides are turning in our favor and the people are waking up and people are questioning these vaccines now. I mean, look at the vaccine. The childhood schedule. I mean, what was it? 6 vaccines in 1982 prior to the schedule or prior to the Compensation Act of 86, something like that. And then now, how many vaccines are on the schedule now? We have over 120 on the schedule with the COVID vaccines. And when is the end in sight? When do you think, when is enough is the question? And how many vaccines do you think we'll have by 2030, 2040, unless we say enough is enough?
Yes, for the pharmaceutical industry, there's never enough. All they can do because of that act, because they have no liability for death or injury caused by their vaccines on the childhood recommended schedule from the CDC, they have a perfect business model. They have a mandatory market. Children ostensibly have to get these vaccines to go to public school in particular, and there's no liability. All they can do is make a massive profit. And that's all they're really interested in. It's their stockholders, it's their bottom line, and they will keep putting vaccines or shots or whatever they might call them for lesser and lesser conditions on the market, even though in the case of the COVID shot, there's clear evidence that it's not only not necessary in children, but particularly dangerous. So it has to be stopped, and it will be stopped. And there are many ways in which people are approaching this, but we need to bring people's attention to it in the first place, and that's the role of film.
Right, 100%. Keep telling the story. People are moved by emotion again, going back to that and telling that story. I mean, the whole word motion is an emotion. So once you have that emotional component, that's when you move people, you inspire people, and you encourage people. Doc, I'm going to just kind of go back in all the questions that I get in the vaccine realm. I'm just going to ask a lot of those kind of questions that I get. And something that I've been I used to be afraid to talk about with people. I'm bold with the vaccines and autism, but something that I feel like is a direct correlation with what we're seeing today is this gender dysphoria. I mean, we have, like, if you go to like soundchoice.org and you see all the aborted fetal cell lines and you look at, Dr. Plotkin's, the deposition, and talks about all the abortions that were used in the vaccine industry. I mean, we have Windsor Institute 38, the cell line from a female lung, from a mortal cell and everything else. But, I think from like an epigenetic standpoint, during, neurosynaptogenesis, the developmental stages of the nervous system, that first year of life or first 2 years of life, we vaccinate at a high rate. Do you think there's a correlation between this gender dysphoria and abortal cell lines in these vaccines from an epigenetic standpoint?
Right. It's a very, very interesting and pertinent question, the current state of affairs. Let me step back and answer it in 2 parts. One, less specifically to the cell lines, but to the role of the environment in gender dysphoria. And here's a series of questions that you might want to ask. And one is that let us take seizures, epilepsy. Epilepsy is highly significantly more common in children with autism than those children without autism. Epilepsy is a clear neurological disorder. And so that association does not make autism a psychological disease. It makes it a comorbid condition with epilepsy. It means that it must have a neurological and organic origin. It's not a psychological problem. Now, why do I say this? Because gender dysphoria is also significantly greater, as I understand it, in children with autism and neurodevelopmental disorders than not. Therefore, it's not a natural variant. It, just like seizures, like epilepsy, is a comorbid problem that goes along in many children with neurodevelopmental disorder. So this comes down to how we perceive it. The other argument against it being a normal variant, and this is where the evolutionary biologist takes up the question, is that these children do not, by and large, or will not, by and large, go on to have children of their own. In other words, their genes will not be perpetuated in the way that evolutionary biology demands for survival of the fittest. So they will, if it were a normal variant, we wouldn't see this because it would have died out, because the propagation of the genetic component would disappear. I hope that makes sense. All of these things these two things together mean that gender dysphoria is a genuine organic disorder of some sort. It's not a normal variant. It's not something that's always been with us at anything like the kind of level that we appear to be seeing it now. So that's number one. Number two, then, does it come down, if we are saying that and we're testing a biologically plausible hypothesis, is exposure through the use of female cell lines in making vaccines going to determine or have an aberrant effect upon the sexual evolution of the person exposed at a critical stage in life? And human sexuality is determined very early in life, at least in animal species. Then it is biologically plausible. And moreover, it's a testable hypothesis. You could set up, if you wanted to, you should, an animal model of this kind of exposure early on. Does it influence the elements of gender dysphoria or normal gender development? So for all those reasons, it's an entirely reasonable question to posit, a hypothesis to put forward, and it's testable. Design the right study, test the hypothesis, and ask the question, is this an organic problem, and can we get closer to what's actually generating it? Not to brush it off by saying in a non-scientific way, oh, you're just anti this or anti that. No, let's step right back from the emotion and let's ask the kind of question that you're asking. Where did this come from and why? Because its mere existence is not compatible with the propagation of the human species. If this were to affect everybody, we'd die out in a very short space of time. So that's a sort of long-winded answer to your question, but it's an entirely reasonable question.
Well, Doc, I think I was answered very well. I do have a lot of questions, though, just around this area. Going back to in the history of why we have, I think it's comical that we even have exemptions in the States here. Let me rephrase that. I think it's comical that we even need a pharmaceutical permission to refuse a vaccine. I think we should just be able to have the right to say no thanks. I mean, we have medical exemptions here, and they're coming after those exemptions. They're coming after religious exemptions, the philosophical exemptions. I mean, do you know why we even had the religious exemption in the first place? I mean, from a historical standpoint, why that was put in place?
I imagine it was part of what was enshrined in the Constitution, is that, bodily autonomy was like freedom of speech. You have the right. It is not given to you by the government.
Right.
It's given by God. I mean, that was the sort of elements of, I imagine. And just there is absolutely no excuse either for the doctor, from the doctor's perspective, or from the human, from the moral perspective, to force any kind of medical procedure on anyone. People should have absolute bodily autonomy.
Right.
And that is something that's enshrined in medical practice. And so it is totally inappropriate, but it goes back to this. It is an element of their failure. Their failing means that they have to put laws in place to remove philosophical, religious, medical exemptions or narrow them down to in the most constrained way for medical exemptions, even to the extent that even if you've had a life-threatening event before with a vaccine, you're still okay to absolutely ridiculous. But it is, again, take it as a measure of their failure that they have to put these extraordinarily coercive laws in place or remove the rights of citizens in order to get them to comply with their profiteering and policy. And it's entirely wrong.
Right. I like to use the word coercion. I think that's the better word for it. Anytime you're forced to do something against your will, it's really you're coerced, and it should be illegal, and it's criminal. But going back to this topic in the vaccine, or I'm sorry, the abortion, the aborted fetal cell lines like Walvax2, MRC5, these other ingredients. How deep do these roots go with the abortion industry and the vaccine industry and their relationship?
It's a very good question, and I'm not the person to answer that. I wish I knew. I hadn't. It's not something I've specifically studied, although I'm fully aware of it, and people should be absolutely entitled to say no based upon this alone. My religious beliefs do not allow me to comply. I won't, but it's not a subject on which I'm an expert. You probably know much more than I do about it.
Well, I appreciate the honesty, and it's something that that I'm just passionate about, because I do believe that we're not being told a lot with their relationship. Because I do remember 15, 20 years ago, it was making national news that Planned Parenthood was selling aborted fetal cell parts, and I was going, well, who's buying? Because that's a big part of it. And I do believe that it's part of the vaccine industry and manufacturing process. But Dr. Wakefield,
I will just say there was an excellent interview with Aaron Siri. I think it may even have been a deposition testimony.
who was the name?
Stanley Plotkin and Aaron Siri. Aaron Siri is a lawyer,
Yes.
an outstanding lawyer working with Del Bigtree's group, ICANN. And he undertook an outstanding deposition on Stanley Plotkin.
Yes.
And that is where it addresses this issue comprehensively and is well worth going to study that.
Right. And the Stanley Plotkin is a 9-hour deposition, and it is a very intensive, and I highly recommend watching that because it's an eye opener for so many people. So going back to that, Doc, in your book, defending the, is it autism child? I'm sorry, what's the title of that book? The defending
Callous disregard, which
there was the one you talked about intestinal permeability, leaky gut.
Oh yes, waging war on the autistic.
Waging war. It's literally right on in my desk in my office, so for patients to read. So I pick it up periodically and read through that. And I just want to talk to you about leaky gut and just kind of the science behind that. And when patients have that, in your line of work, what would you recommend for a patient that has an intestinal permeability? Do probiotics, fermented foods help that? What would you recommend for patients or children that have that? Have you seen any progress with what you would recommend?
Yes, permeability increase or changes in intestinal permeability often reflect inflammation of the lining of the bowel, the mucosa. And that's how I came to this, because it was a feature of what was my particular interest when I was back at the Royal Free in London, the Royal Free Hospital, studying this, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Then abnormal intestinal permeability, increased permeability, was a feature of the inflammation in those conditions, in celiac disease as well. So it was something that we looked at in the setting of autistic bowel disease. Others had done the same and demonstrated abnormal increase in permeability that went along with the inflammation. And back in those days, what we had was treatments that we would historically use for Crohn's and colitis. So 5-amino-salicylate-based drugs, aspirin-like anti-inflammatories, and we found those produced not only improvement in the gastrointestinal symptoms, but marked improvement in the behavioral and cognitive symptoms as well. And that was fascinating. That was, what is this link between the gut and the brain? Here we have a clear demonstration that what had been reported historically to be an irreversible condition, autism, is now responding to something that targets inflammation in the gut. That's fascinating. Could it be that something happening in the gut is influencing the brain, either directly or indirectly? Now, that opens up a multitude of hypotheses. Is it that the bacteria are in the gut are producing toxins that are getting to the brain? Is it that the inflammation is allowing dietary peptides from gluten, from casein, cow's milk products, into the bloodstream that are having an impact upon the brain? Is it an immune effect upon the brain? Is it allowing other toxins in? It was a fascinating, as a scientist and as a clinician, it raised all kinds of intriguing possibilities, and again, all testable hypotheses. The problem is that our work was sabotaged at that stage, that we were deliberately, willfully sabotaged and prevented from doing this work because it was inevitably associated in some way. It led back to the vaccine. And so I lost my job now. So I wish I could have had answers for you at this stage. I don't have the answers that I should do all these years later because the work was sabotaged. Others have continued it, and others have done some wonderful work, as you've mentioned, with probiotics, prebiotics, nutritional supplementation, the combination of these various therapies, anti-inflammatory medication, gluten and casein-free diets. And it's very encouraging to see that so many children have been helped as a consequence of those.
Right.
But I wish we could give you even more heartening news, but the work was unfortunately sabotaged.
But I want the listeners to understand the magnitude of your work. I mean, arguably, your work is the most profound, how do you say it, link to the fact that there was an epigenetic cause, not a genetic cause, an epigenetic cause and correlation between vaccinations and autism, that there's a causal factor in the gut that just correlated with autistic children. And that's why they targeted you so bad, Doc. And you know that. And they targeted you because they're trying to push a narrative that autism is congenital, that it's a genetic issue, that it's a genetic pathology, that they're born this way, that it's just, there's no environmental factors, there's no other cause for the reason. But we do know that there is a cause, that there is a correlation. And so your work is arguably, I would say, the most important work, and it's such an evil thing that it was sabotaged. And I want people to understand that it goes back to truth is treason, empire of lies, Doc. And your work is going to be carried on. It is, it is going to be passed on. And it is, I want you to be encouraged that people are listening. There are people that are looking for this information. So going back to the gut imbalances in your work that was sabotaged in this, I mean, I know I can't help but think of Dr. Sabine's work too. She was testing the stools of these babies that had their mothers received a COVID vaccine in utero, and she found that these babies had zero bifidobacterium in the stools. I mean, what would you say to that kind of line of work? And what do you think would be maybe to come about, and now with this mRNA technology showing massive decreases in gut imbalances and gut bacteria, what do you think we're going to see now going forward in the rise of autism and these autoimmune disorders coming about?
I think the wonderful thing about what has happened is in science, not in the way it's been sabotaged, but is the understanding that the microbiome is so important. As my colleague Simon Murch used to say at the Royal Free, no man is an island. And and what he meant by that is that we are so interdependent with the bacteria on our skin and our gut and everywhere. And so it was a fascinating shift that we had been for so long trying to kill bacteria with the perception that they were all bad for us, when in fact we would not survive. We would not be here on this planet without them. So, and the work that's been done in the setting of COVID is so important. And I noted that not only did she present that to some very learned societies, but then nobody wanted to touch the paper when it came to publishing it. And it's so sad and it's so wrong. And it's people making decisions based out of fear and fear of loss of their reputations, fear of loss of income to their journals, whatever that might be. And one of the dangers is that the pharmaceutical companies have taken charge of the editorial in so many journals by giving them money, as they have done with politicians and the mainstream media. So this is where people have to understand that the science has been compromised beyond all recognition. It is no longer the science that people sought to practice before with an open mind. Right. The results are the results, irrespective of whether they support your original belief system or not. And particularly when they threaten your bottom line, they're forbidden. And so we're going to see more of this, but we're going to see it overturned. We're going to see it changed as the public come to realize that they've been deceived. I truly believe that. It may not happen in my lifetime, but it is happening, and we have to take up this mantle, and we need collectively, as you point out, to put the situation right.
Be that light in the darkness. I mean, that's the way I view it, Doc. I feel like I could talk to you all day, Doc, and just converse about this. I would love to, just continue these conversations with you. And I just am so thankful and appreciative of you and all that you do. And I just can't help but think of the quote by Martin Luther King Jr., who stated that the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in times of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. Doc, you stood with integrity, and you have, just really been a great example of one who stood in the gap and continues to face persecution, to face that slander, but continue to persevere. And I just pray, that you just have that encouragement and continue to fight that fight. And any way I can help and support you, I will continue to do that. And I would love to just really support you in any way I can. So if you're listening, I pray that you go to the film, watch this film, share his information, and continue to fight the fight. Dr. Wakefield, I'm going to give you the last word here. And I'd like you just to kind of leave the audience with just a word of encouragement and, and just maybe the final word on advice and what to do the days ahead and maybe what you expect here in the days to come.
Right, thank you. I would say to people, when you stand in the gap, when you stand in those dark times, remember that it's not about you. Okay, one of the greatest revelations to me and one of the greatest burdens lifted from my shoulders, it's not about me. It's about something far more important. And when you're down and feeling that the world's against you, remember, they don't know you. These people who are writing this kind of nonsense in the newspapers or spouting it on television, they don't know you. They have a script, and that's what they're told to stick to. It's not about you, and it's not about me. It's about the child who, in this case, who has no voice, who's lost their voice and cannot speak for themselves, and it's our duty to speak for them. So if you're feeling depressed and, in one of those dark moments, look up at the sky and remember, this isn't about you. It's about something much bigger, much more important. And yes, my job is to go on making films, and with the help of your listeners and others, we'll be able to do that. Films are not cheap, but when I was in the clinic, I could help one child at a time. When you make a movie like this, you can help hundreds of thousands of people. You can inform, as long as you remain in integrity and honesty, and you can inform many, many people at the same time. So film is an extraordinarily powerful medium, and it's one that I enjoy, and hopefully we can bring benefit and change to many people's lives.
Amen, Doc. And if you have a word of encouragement for other men in the gap, for just men specifically, because this fight, as much as as anybody else, there's so many women, the mama bears, and they have been awesome. And nothing to discredit the mama bears in this fight, because every vaccine seminar, it was 99% women. And it's like, okay, we need the men now to step into the fight. And I feel like they are stepping into the fight. So word of encouragement for other men in the gap here. How can other men get involved? And just give a word of encouragement for the men.
Yeah, for the men, you need to ask yourself the question, what will my grandchildren say to me on my deathbed?
Ooh, that's good.
And that's the question that you need to be able to answer. And if you did nothing, then you have nothing to say to them. One thing that Vax taught me in particular was that people thought they were alone. Fathers thought they were alone. Mothers thought they were alone in this battle. When they came to the movie theater and it was packed with people with the same story, who shared their grief, shared their anguish, shared their hopes and dreams, then they stood together in a way I'd never seen before, because they realized they were no longer alone. They'd never been alone. They just never had the opportunity to come together in this way. So another benefit of film is to give people that sort of communal setting in which they can share their anxieties and start the healing process. So,
amen. What would it look like if we, as men and women, stood for every injustice in the world? The world would be a different place. And I just pray we are encouraged by this. You know, we just never know how far reaching something we may think, say, or do today will affect the lives of millions tomorrow. If you're listening, your voice matters. You don't necessarily have to make films, but you can just get out there and just share the film. You can get out there and you can just help support, and that will do wonders. And I just want to leave on an encouragement passage here. You know, we live in dark times, but the sun is always shining on the other side of the clouds. And Matthew 11:30 says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So look up, give those burdens to the Lord, and continue to be the salt and light of the earth. Dr. Wakefield, God bless you, my friend. Thank you so much for all that you do, and thank you for this interview.
thank you so much, Ben. Thank you.
To August of last year, nobody really knew who I was.
There's about 12 people who are producing 65% of anti-vaccine misinformation.
We need to come together as Americans and realize that we have a war at hand here. Right?
Like, dude, how scared of this shit do you have to be, right, to be wearing gloves, a face shield, and mask at this point?
Help us to urge folks and say to them, look, it's time to roll up your sleeve and get the shot.
Chiropractor in Omaha, Nebraska, responsible for 65% of the anti-vaccine misinformation. Put what I say to the test. Just don't write me off as crazy misinformation.
Doctor, please bring yourself in order.
600,000 people will die of cancer. 300,000 people will die of obesity this year. When is enough enough?